Hello, and thank you for joining today's People Analytics Perspectives webinar, Evolving to Total Workforce Planning. Before we get to the expert panel we've assembled, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. All participants will be in listen-only mode during today's presentation. Please feel free to use the chat feature located on the right side of your screen to enter any questions or issues you may have during the session. There will be time for some Q&A near the end of this webinar. We will, of course, follow up directly with any inquiries we aren't able to address in our live forum today. Today's session is being recorded, and a link to that replay will be provided to all registered attendees shortly after the conclusion of our webinar. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host, Stella Lupashore. Stella is the founder and chief reframer at ReframeWork, Inc., and we're delighted to have her at the helm of today's conversation. Stella?
Thanks so much, Dawn. Pleasure to be here. I'm so thrilled to host the second webinar in our series, and I am thrilled to introduce another great speaker who will be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is workforce planning. So Michael Benjamin, he is the head of consulting and business development with TrustSphere. And second speaker is my partner in crime in this webinar series, Anthony Ebalibanda, who is the head of analytics with TrustSphere. I am welcoming both of you to this webinar, and I would love to hear your perspectives and learn from you, and also share some of your knowledge and insights from the clients you worked with, from the products you've implemented, on what they can take back to their organizations or their customers. So I'll start, Michael, with you. First of all, what is workforce planning? What is strategic workforce planning? And what is total talent planning? I think a lot of times we interchangeably hear those definitions, and they each have slightly different terms. So can you just clarify the definition for us, what it is and how we should think about it?
Great. Thank you, Stella. And if we could advance the slide. So first off, Stella, thank you for the promotion. I am the head of consulting and biz dev for Brightfield, not TrustSphere. But I don't need to do it for two companies, but I appreciate that. TrustSphere is a great company. So in Brightfield's view, as we think about workforce planning, it's really three parts. The first part is trying to project out what the demand for getting work done. And I use work specifically. I'm not talking about workers yet. Because some of the work may actually get automated and we may not need workers. And so the first part is to figure out work, and we're going to cover the wheel on the left side in a moment. The second part is once I understand that demand, then I need to go figure out who do I have and what do I want to do to fill that demand. And some of that is what work can get automated with bots or just pure efficiencies of automation. And then what work can be done with my employee base, what work ought to be done with different categories of contingent. There are lots of different categories of contingent. And then hopefully as a part of figuring that out, I understand some cyclicality, because it's not like I can just staff up employees for peaks, right? And valleys may not be exactly the right answer either. So I need to understand what percentage of my work ought to be flexible from the work that's not going to get automated and work that's not going to get fully outsourced. Then once I figure out that part, so I figured out demand, I figured out how we're going to get the work done, then I need to then understand the trade-offs and just make sure I refine my point of view. Like I may know that I need to directionally have this much flexibility and these kinds of IT resources because our projects scale up and down. But what are the trade-offs in quality and efficiency of finding those resources, the cost of those resources, and risks like intellectual property or legal risks or those kinds of things. And I need to apply those lenses on top of my point of view to then really vet the plan. And so starts with the direction, figure out the needs, figure out what I have, figure out how work's going to get done in the future and with whom, and the types of resources, apply the trade-offs, and then start executing and remeasuring.
Excellent. This is really comprehensive and holistic, and I like the fact that you're starting from the units of work not a job description, not a position, because I think that's where we run into challenges if we plan the current traditional ways, the workforce. And now when the definition of what really work is changing in itself with all the digital disruption, I think it's even more important to start from that and then plan backwards in terms of resource impact and workplace impact, etc. So the other question is, as you work with your clients to apply some of these definition and help them understand what work even is and how you then find the right type of skills and how you price it, what are some of the challenges that you see customers running into when they deal with this?
Sure. And so I'll start with the challenges and kind of why should we do this? And then we'll talk a little bit about how those things are applied. So there could be lots of challenges in different types of organizations, but there are three in particular that we hear often. One is ownership or the governance, right? So it's often pretty clear who owns employees, but sometimes contingent labor is owned outside of HR. You know, about half the time in the U.S. it's owned outside of HR. It's owned by procurement, and in different geographies that can vary a little bit. In Europe, it's growing. We're a little bit more in HR at times, or people seeking more of a total talent view. So one is there's no one that really owns the whole thing. And it's not that someone needs to own the whole thing, but at a minimum, you have to have governance. You have to figure out how all these parties come together, from talent acquisition, talent management, procurement, other places, so they can actually think about workforce planning more holistically. And is workforce planning even done in HR? It's not always the case either. Sometimes that's sitting in the business unit function, like it's sitting in the call center resources, or it's sitting in the IT resources. Sometimes it's sitting in talent acquisition. Even where workforce planning sits can vary. So ownership and governance, something people got to figure out. Once we figure out we want to do this and there's enough organization around doing this, then there's the data conformity and taxonomy. So as we think about it, it may be that your HR system, maybe it's Workday or something else, you've decided to store your contingent workers onto your HR system, but typically that's a very small subset of content about those contingent workers that you have. And so typically you have a vendor management system, like a Beeline or a Fieldglass, and then you have your HRIS system, and sometimes you have different job codes, different job descriptions are written. The way you write job descriptions for contingent, totally different than employees. And so just even being able to understand how these workers match up like for like, and all those kinds of things, that tends to be a challenge. At Brightfield, we've actually automated all this stuff through artificial intelligence. We just intake all this stuff in from their VMS and HRIS, and machines do all this stuff that humans would take weeks to do, sometimes months, around conformity and taxonomy. And then it's understanding the trade-offs. So if we think about quality, efficiency, cost, and risk, we teach those elements in CCWP for contingent labor. CCWP is the certification in contingent labor. And in TDX, our platform, we get into benchmarking those things. So what is the time to fill for a Java plus Ruby software developer as a permanent hire versus a contingent? What is the cost of a contingent labor in this market and for this length of assignment, around those things, so I can even make cost trade-offs? So, from our platform perspective and from our consulting perspective, we help organizations through those things, through the tools. But understanding those trade-offs, if you don't understand those trade-offs, you're probably just still at a high level, which is, I think I need this many employees and I think I need this amount of flexible workers, but I really have no idea around how long it's going to take them, if it's even reasonable to find these kinds of people, if it's going to cost me a lot more. So it's not just about headcount, it's about all these trade-offs. And so those are the three things that organizations work through. We certainly help amongst all three. And then, of course, the reason why you got to do this is your labor costs if you really focus around cost rather than headcount, that's the most expensive thing on your balance sheet. And so why not get that right? And as the market is evolving, as it's changing, as organizations are trying to figure out how to do more with less and figure out the right types of strategies for their workers, it's really important to figure this out the right way.
I love that thought, because what I also hear is the fact that organizations need to start getting serious in terms of how they manage this process. It is another type of labor that requires the same type of rigor as regular employees, going through the same type of assessment, understanding the price points, understanding the quality, even though the tenure in many times is significantly shorter than the regular employees. So it requires to be much more nimble. So that's where I think a platform like TDX comes in so timely to help with some of that analysis and speed up the assessment and decision making. This is great. So when we start thinking about the workforce, the total workforce planning, the way you describe it, obviously this is more taking an analytics view, a more data-driven decision making about your workforce. And it is, hard structured data about skills, capabilities, and costs and timing and trade-offs that you're dealing with. There is another aspect of how the work gets done when it comes to relationship management in organizations, connections, information flow, etc. So I think that's where TrustSphere plays a role too, and has a different view into what workforce planning looks like or needs to look like based on the relationships in the organization. So Anthony, would you like to describe what your thoughts in terms of TrustSphere approach in influencing the workforce planning decision making based on the data you analyze?
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for that, Stella. From our standpoint at TrustSphere, we really look at workforce planning as a part of a broader, what I call, organization strategy. And as Michael started to describe, this is when you think about workforce planning, it's not just one monolithic component. You got several aspects of things that you need to take into consideration to see what good looks like for your own organization. So what we do at TrustSphere is, I think, it's sometimes the second part of that process, which is understanding currently how work gets done from a communication flow, i.e., we're looking at the digital footprint of an organization and try to utilize that to support certain decision in regard to workforce planning. And specifically, I can just say something when people are doing around org design, people are, Michael said you need to do more with less. We've got some clients who are saying we're going to try to revamp our offices, and we're trying to see what's the best way to position people next to one another. By understanding who interacts with whom the most and seeing the actual efficiency of those interactions, you can help from an org design perspective to say, guess what? You know what? Everybody that works in accounts payable is normally talking a lot with people in payroll or people in, let's say, in HR ops. Why don't we have those two groups next to one another to facilitate the communication? And you see then how better or how worse the organization is performing. So from a TrustSphere perspective, we try to understand how the communication flows and how we can then leverage that understanding to help on certain aspects. So org design is one thing. Another client of ours was like talking about understanding the need to have people in one place or another. And we measure the strength of those relationships to try to then justify from a business standpoint if you need to have what we call remote working versus people all in the same office. So our aspect of the workforce planning is really to try to support what people call gut feeling and have this on a data-driven viewpoint. So that's my thing. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And I think it really goes back to all the things that Michael was talking about in terms of you need to look at it from a very holistic standpoint. It's just there's several aspects, and you're not going to get all the top marks in the things that you're changing. But you need to take the accumulation of those and see what this accumulation looks like for you from an optimum standpoint.
Right.
And if I was to kind of like really talk about us as an organization, when you think about social network analytics and organizational network analytics, there's one thing that we do is really to go from information to insight. And we've got a slide that shows the ramp up of what we analyze, how we actually take this information to then come up with some insights. And we bring that into the workforce planning process as well as other element of the employee life cycle. And I don't know if you can see my screen, but there's a kind of like a pyramid that shows those different stages, in terms of like understanding those interaction so that you can get to the insight and bring some outcomes to it. So if I was to bring it back to the workforce planning, you can look at this, you observe the communication, and then you try to understand things and try to then leverage that collective relationship to try to improve collaboration and individual interaction.
Great. So in a way, you are augmenting the traditional type of planning with additional layer of understanding of how the work actually gets done, where the flow occurs of the communications, of the information, of touch points, as well as, I guess, gain different types of insights, determining what great performance might look like, and where do you go to find them and get inspired so you can then possibly replicate across the organization some of those team dynamics or interactions, right?
Yes, that's it. And as I always say, though, ONA is not the answer to everything. Mm-hmm. But as you say, it's just another strong signal that supports a broader process. So when we're thinking about the total workforce planning, within that total workforce planning, you will have signals that help you make some decisions. ONA bring you that extra signal to reinforce elements that you might know of or that you might have a gut feeling about.
Great. And I want to pipe in a question that Lexi Martin asked, which is quite interesting. So when we started the webinar, my question was, what is workforce planning, what is strategic workforce planning, and what is the total workforce planning? And I think, Michael, you touched upon the first and the last, and we spend less time probably on the strategic definition of that. And I think, Anthony, some of the analysis that you are bringing with organizational network analysis or some of the non-traditional ones adds a little more nuance to the strategic. But if I was to take a stab of the definition of what I believe the strategic workforce planning is, it's looking at both sides, looking at the long-term direction where the organization needs to be, right? What business are we even going to be in with all the digital disruption and reshaping of a lot of industries? What capabilities do we need to develop so we can survive in that long term? What do we have internally, and how do we bridge the gap between now and then? Do we, hire? Do we augment with contractors? Do we develop a digital bot to put in place to do some of that work? But it's more of a taking a longer term type view and thinking from a business perspective, thinking from product and market perspective, and then backing into the workforce and work itself. I don't know if either one of you have an opinion or a different point of view.
Sure, Stella, it's Michael. I'll just add to it. I agree with what you're describing. I think the way I think about workforce planning is depending on the business unit sometimes, as well as the organization, it can vary a little bit. Like I think the ideal state around strategic is, I think, what you described, which is what's the work going to be 3 to 5 years from now? How do we look at it from a work perspective and a competencies required to complete the work? How do we go figure out what our gaps are in competency, not just in head, right? And then what's the most what's the smartest way of filling those gaps in those competencies. Some of that could be, go generate future talent pools. Some of that may be go grow that talent because those workers don't exist for us to buy those workers right away at that level. We're going to need to hire them 5 years from, earlier and train them up. Or maybe we need to outsource that capability because it's not really core. It's really thinking about those kinds of things and having the timeline a little further out in order to be able to actually do something. In my mind, that's strategic. But if you're a large organization, like I came from Bank of America, right? So over 200,000 workers. When we think about it for IT, IT is really interested about focusing on your projects. They have all these projects they need to do. They really need to focus around how do I figure out what talent do I need in order to go execute on all these projects that we've now approved, and what rolling on and off of projects, and whether you're a large professional services firm or an IT portion of your business, you're thinking about those things. If you have a large retail or call center piece, you may be thinking about some of the strategic things 3 years from now, or you're thinking about automation of bots and bringing some of that kind of capability in for customer engagement. But largely, you're also thinking more short term. 2 months from now, what's the schedule? What's the demand? What's the cyclicality of the demand? And how do I make sure I have enough resources to staff all the different kinds of roles that I need? And my timeline's much shorter in what I look at. And so whether you're looking at for 3 to 5 years in terms of trying to figure out how do we deliver on the demand of where the business direction is going, and how do I do that at the most effective cost, and also to make sure I got all the right resources in place, then versus project-based or short-term based, that can vary in different types of businesses.
Yeah. And Michael, since you brought up the digital, I really am keen on hearing your point of view on digital labor and how that plays into the workforce planning. How do you plan for bots?
So a couple of things about bots, and, everyone's like, well, where does that come in? How do I plan for it? Is it going to replace my job? So I think the purpose of bots is to actually increase engagement with customers, and whether they're internal or external customers. And I think it's to do some things that you don't have time to do. And some of it is to make better decisions, so you don't have to do funny math and guess and use intuition, because the smartest machines or machine models are really thinking and learning from all these data points that humans just can't crunch. Bots just take it further in terms of interaction. And so I'll give you an example. So from an HR's perspective, I think the people analytics capability in HR, I think there's a opportunity for us to talk about how do we even think about that for HR. Our business is HR. How do we think about it for automating HR? And one of the areas that we can automate is talent acquisition, right? It's very common. Lots of bots out there, lots of things to automate there. And that's talent acquisition for permanent or contingent, right? So on the permanent or contingent side, sometimes it's about candidate interaction. It's candidate scheduling. Who wants to deal with that? Nobody. But the candidate cares, you care, but you don't have time to do callbacks back and forth. Why not have a bot text message back and forth with someone and get those things done? Why not have a bot ask the 5 pre-screening questions in an interactive way with follow-up questions, rather than just fill out a website 5 questions that are yes, no. It's not as much of an interactive environment, and you don't get as much in those pre-screening questions. On the hiring manager side, they're the other customer that we can influence, like Beeline, vendor management system. They have a Beeline assistant as an Alexa skill. You go, hey, Alexa, what's the cost of a software developer in Denver for these kinds of skills? And the Beeline, the Alexa will answer. Or please start a rec. I need one of these kinds of roles. Why would you want to answer those mundane questions? you're servicing the hiring manager, giving them direct access. It's really simple. They don't have to email. You don't have to follow up. They don't have to worry about where that was. They don't have to call somebody. They can do it on their phones. Those are all great examples of things that we should automate. And I haven't removed anybody's job, but I've now increased the client satisfaction of candidates and hiring managers in some measurable ways. So those are examples how digital can really help. And then you have new sets of skills that you have to staff for, of who's going to go program these things and who's going to manage these interactions, and if they have these kinds of questions, these should be the next set of questions. So lots of activity with organizations working with bots in different ways.
Excellent. We are running out of time, and I wanted to open up for any Q&A that anyone might have, so please send them through the chat. And I do have one last question related to the implications of privacy and digital transformation on the future of the workforce planning. So I'm thinking, when it comes to new regulation, GDPR, that is coming into force next year in Europe, that'll have a significant impact on a lot of the clients in terms of how they can manage and plan. So if you have any point of view, Anthony, from your perspective of how you've dealt with some of these implications, please do share.
Yeah, if there's only one piece of advice I can give to people is, this is something that I was given by a colleague of mine, is get to know your compliance, risk, and privacy officer by their first name. Because if you are on the front foot and being able to clearly articulate the information that you intend on utilizing and the purpose that you're trying to achieve, they're going to be able to help you, because they're going to be much more aware of new regulation, new implications. If you get them into the picture earlier on, your projects or any initiative that you're going to be doing going forward is going to be much easier. The last thing that any organization or anybody wants is surprises. And bringing the compliance and risk and legal people at the 11th hour might scupper a perfectly fine project or initiative, because there is some elements that never were taken into consideration. So if there was one piece of advice I could give to people, is from the get-go, involve those privacy specialists, because it might seem cumbersome and tiring at the beginning, but you're going to gain way more going forward and further down the road.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that. And thank you, both of you, for coming and sharing your insights. I feel like we can talk for hours about this topic, because there's so much to unfold. Things that we didn't get to, like how do you start? Where do you focus your initial energy if you're to deploy workforce planning? And hopefully during some of the following subsequent sessions, we will touch on some of them. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. We will be sharing the recording shortly, and I'll give the mic back to Dawn to close.
Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for joining our People Analytics Perspective webinar, Evolving to Total Workforce Planning. We hope you found the information relevant and useful, and encourage you to reach out to any of our speakers for further conversation. As mentioned, this is an ongoing series of webinars and podcasts around people analytics. Please look for our next session in the series early in 2018. If you do have additional questions or would like more information, please feel free to go to our website at www.trustsphere.com. This does conclude today's session. Thank you and have a wonderful day.